All right, so you've shared this document with us, Science Woke Ideology Manifesto 5.pdf. It looks pretty dense.
It is, yeah. There's a lot in there.
So for this deep dive, let's try and, pull out the core of what it's arguing, understand the main points without getting too tangled up in academic jargon, if we can help it.
Absolutely. And the document really jumps right into what it sees as a major tension, maybe even a conflict in today's world.
Okay.
It's framing this conflict between how science fundamentally works and what the manifesto itself calls woke ideology. It paints them as, well, almost opposing forces.
Opposing forces. So the big picture here is this clash, science versus this ideology. And according to the manifesto, it's not just a minor disagreement.
No, not at all. It's presented as a difference in their very foundations, their core ways of approaching things, how they see the world, what their goals are.
Okay, so how does it build that case? What kind of arguments does it lay out? Where does it focus?
It looks at a few key areas. It talks about the ethos of each, sort of the guiding spirit or principles.
Ethos, right.
Then it examines their goals, what they're trying to achieve in society. And crucially, their epistemology.
Epistemology. Okay, that's how they think about knowledge, how we know things.
Exactly. What counts as valid knowledge, how you arrive at truth. It also touches on, how this impacts society, institutions, and even the basic purpose of asking questions, of inquiry itself.
Got it. That sounds pretty comprehensive. So let's start with this term, woke ideology. The word woke is thrown around so much. How does this specific document define it?
Yeah, that's vital. The manifesto is really clear. It's not just talking about, say, being aware of social injustice.
Okay.
It defines work as a very particular ideological framework, a set of ideas it believes is actively working to, deconstruct and reshape society based on a specific concept of equity.
So reshaping society, not just pointing out problems, it sees it as a deliberate strategy.
Precisely, a coherent ideology. And it argues that while this ideology might sometimes sound like it just wants a seat at the table, one voice among many, it actually views itself, according to the manifesto, as fundamentally incompatible with Western traditions, Western values, and critically, the very principles that underpin science.
Incompatible. That's quite a claim. Does it talk about where these ideas, this ideology comes from, its roots?
It does. It suggests woke ideology isn't new. Exactly. It traces it back through a lineage of thought. The names might change, but it argues there's an underlying logic.
And what's key to that logic, according to the manifesto?
A major element it points to is the idea that centralizing power is the key way to achieve its goals.
Centralizing power. How does that play into the critique?
Well, the manifesto argues that while you can centralize power in, say, an organization, you can't really centralize things like local knowledge, what people know about their own situations, or individual will, individual agency.
Right, those are inherently dispersed.
Exactly. And the document suggests that trying to suppress that local knowledge or individual freedom actually hinders real progress and, human flourishing. It sees a tension there.
And this idea of the collective, it seems important in the manifesto's description.
Yes. It argues this push for central control is often justified by claiming to speak for the collective. But it warns this can lead to a sort of logic like, I speak for the collective, so if you oppose me, you oppose the collective itself.
Ah, I see.
And the manifesto notes that the terms oppressed and collective are often used almost interchangeably, depending on the context. It suggests a kind of strategic flexibility there.
Okay, so that's the picture it paints of woke ideology, aiming for change via centralized power, speaking for a collective. Now, you mentioned 3 pillars the manifesto uses to break this down. Let's take the first one, projected ethos and the noble lie. What's that about?
Right. Pillar 1. This is where it gets into the moral dimension. The manifesto argues that this ideology projects a specific moral stance, an ethos, which it labels a noble lie.
Noble lie, like Plato.
Exactly like Plato from the Republic. The idea of a foundational myth, maybe not literally true, but told by rulers to keep society stable or guide it in a certain direction.
So how does the manifesto apply that ancient idea here? What's the alleged noble lie of woke ideology?
The argument is that the ideology claims its moral high ground, its legitimacy, by presenting itself as the sole authentic voice for the oppressed.
The only voice.
The exclusive representative, yes. By doing that, it ceased to make its criticisms inherently righteous and basically beyond challenge, morally unassailable.
That phrase from the document stood out, the uncriticizable critic.
That's the concept. This projected ethos, this noble lie, creates what the manifesto calls the uncriticizable critic. someone who critiques everything else, but whose own core beliefs are off limits.
So the focus shifts from open inquiry to just opposition.
That's the claim. The manifesto argues the noble lie here is claiming to dismantle hierarchy while actually setting up a new rigid hierarchy, a moral and intellectual one, with this uncriticizable critic at the top.
Okay, so pillar 1 is about establishing this unchallengeable moral authority. What's pillar 2? The goal, institutionalizing the noble lie. How does that follow?
Pillar 2 is about how that claimed moral authority gets turned into real-world influence. The manifesto argues it's used as leverage to, well, subvert and reshape key institutions.
Like what kind of institutions?
Education, media, law, government, corporations. The list is pretty extensive in the document.
It talks about the long march through the institutions. That sounds familiar.
Yes, it explicitly references that phrase, often linked to Rudi Dutschke and inspired by Gramsci. The idea isn't violent revolution, but gradually infiltrating institutions, changing their culture and rules from within.
Embedding the ideology inside the system itself.
That's the argument, that these institutions get sort of hollowed out and repurposed. Instead of their original mission, like truth-seeking in universities, which it calls ground zero for this, they become tools for enforcing the ideology and consolidating power, demanding conformity.
And it sees this spreading beyond universities.
Oh, yes. The manifesto claims this mindset, this approach, has moved into corporations, government agencies, NGOs, even global bodies like the UN. And it points to digital platforms, social media, as really accelerating this spread, creating echo chambers, maybe disconnected from diverse real-world experiences.
Right. Okay, so pillar 2, using moral authority to gain institutional control. Now, pillar 3, epistemology, the metaphysical license behind the noble lie. This sounds like the philosophical deep end.
It is a bit, but it's key to the manifesto's whole structure. This pillar looks at the underlying theory of knowledge, the epistemology that the document claims fuels woke ideology.
And where does it trace this epistemology back to?
It points towards Hegel's philosophy and then later developments in neo-Marxism.
Hegel and Marx, big names. What's the connection it's making?
The argument goes something like this. Marx presented his ideas as sort of scientific, based on economics, but his underlying way of thinking, inherited from Hegel, wasn't based on reason as science understands it. And later thinkers, the neo-Marxists, especially figures associated with the Frankfurt School, allegedly took this further. The manifesto suggests they dropped even the pretense of scientific rationality, revealing a more basic rejection of traditional logic and inquiry.
And this Hegelian-derived thinking, it claims a kind of superior knowledge, better than reason.
That's the assertion in the manifesto, yes, that this framework believes it has a deeper insight, a way of knowing that transcends mere logic and evidence. It even mentions Glenn Alexander McGee's work, suggesting Hegel himself drew on esoteric or alchemical traditions.
Alchemy, like turning lead into gold. How does that connect?
It's an analogy the manifesto uses. It paints the uncriticizable critic as a kind of social alchemist.
A social alchemist?
Yeah, someone who thinks they have a special insight, maybe even a sacred duty, to transform society by, say, intensifying contradictions, breaking things down, and remolding everything according to their vision.
And the problem with that, according to the document,
the manifesto argues this social alchemy ignores reality, rejects established moral norms, relies on flawed ideas, and ultimately leads to harmful outcomes, not the promised better future. It disregards consequences, essentially.
Wow, okay. So pillar 3 is about this belief in a special, non-rational way of knowing that justifies radical social transformation. Now, the title, Science versus Woke Ideology. How does the manifesto directly compare them across these pillars? Where's the clash?
Right, this is the crux. It lays out a side-by-side comparison. Ethos versus ethos, goals versus goals, epistemology versus epistemology.
Let's walk through that. Ethos first, the core values. How do they differ?
Manifesto says, science is driven by curiosity, acknowledges its own fallibility, the idea that any scientific understanding could be wrong, and it's open to revision based on evidence. Nothing is sacred dogma.
Okay. Openness and fallibility.
In contrast, it argues woke ideology's ethos is based on the infallibility of the uncriticizable critic, whose authority derives from representing the oppressed, using that noble lie of moral supremacy.
Very different starting points. What about their goals?
Science's goal, according to the document, understanding the world, aiming for individual and societal flourishing through that understanding. It's about knowing, not necessarily controlling.
And woke ideology's goal?
To translate the noble lie into institutional power, subverting institutions, weaponizing language, reconstructing identity, all in service of gaining control and remaking society.
Understanding versus control and transformation.
Okay.
Okay. And finally, epistemology, how they approach knowledge itself.
Manifesto's view. Science relies on evidence, logic, and crucially falsifiability, the idea that a claim must be testable, potentially provable wrong. Contradictions in science are opportunities to learn more.
Right, a puzzle to solve.
Whereas it claims woke ideology sees contradiction differently, almost as raw material for the social alchemist to spin infallible narratives that must guide societal change, regardless of evidence or logic.
Okay, that really draws a sharp line. Given this stark contrast it presents, what does the manifesto suggest should be done? What's the call to action?
It proposes several things. First, setting up and funding specific academic centers.
Centers for what?
To study what it calls ideological capture in universities and work on restoring what it considers sound scientific norms in academia.
So research into the problem itself. What else?
Targeted research initiatives to map out the epistemology and strategies of critical theory, which it sees as the parent of woke ideology, but studied from outside that theory's framework, trying for objectivity.
Okay. And education. Any changes proposed there?
Yes, curriculum reform at all levels, to specifically re-emphasize the values it links to science: falsifiability, open debate, conceptual clarity, rigorous thinking.
Reinstating a certain kind of critical thinking.
Exactly, as the manifesto defines it. And finally, it calls for alliances. Scholars, public intellectuals, institutions joining forces to defend reason and truth-seeking against what it portrays as these encroaching ideological monopolies.
Research, education reform, alliances. What's the ultimate point? Why does the manifesto say this is so important?
It frames this whole effort as crucial for protecting the intellectual immune system of a civilization it believes is grounded in reason and truth. It argues that the integrity of formal knowledge science, humanities, is fundamental to society's health, alongside practical knowledge, of course.
Right. So we've covered a lot: the definition of woke ideology, the three pillars, the contrast with science, the proposed actions. Just to quickly summarize the core argument again.
Sure. In a nutshell, the manifesto argues there's a deep, irreconcilable conflict between science's principles and what it labels woke ideology. And it believes this conflict is seriously damaging higher education and has wider negative consequences for society and intellectual life.
And the three pillars, again, just briefly.
Pillar 1, the projected ethos, the noble lie, creating moral authority. Pillar 2, the goal using that authority to institutionalize the ideology. Pillar 3, the epistemology, the metaphysical license, the special way of knowing that justifies it all. And each contrasted sharply with science.
Definitely a challenging perspective, presenting a very specific viewpoint on current debates. And just to remind everyone, our goal here was simply to unpack the arguments in the manifesto, not to endorse or refute them ourselves.
Absolutely. Just laying out what the document claims.
So as a final thought for our listeners mulling this over, what might that be?
Maybe something like this. Thinking about the manifesto's claims regarding these very different ways of understanding the world science versus this ideology it describes. How do these different frameworks, these different value systems actually shape our society? And what happens, what are the inherent tensions or frictions when these deeply different ways of knowing and valuing collide in the public square, in our institutions, in our everyday lives?
How different systems of belief and knowledge interact, or maybe fail to interact peacefully. Definitely something to think about.